This video was brought to you by Incogni. Hello friends, my name is JJ, and like many nerds, I have long been fascinated by US presidents. Especially the way that presidents of the United States are unique among world leaders in the degree that they serve as important cultural symbols in addition to being powerful politicians. I actually made a whole video a while back exploring exactly why American presidents are infused with so much cultural significance. I think part of it is just that US presidents tend to serve for fairly long, stable terms that often sync up with the start and end of decades, a unit of time that American culture already injects with great cultural importance. I also recently made a video exploring that distinct era of the 20th century that lasted from 1945 up until the late 80s or early 90s, what the Japanese call the Showa age, and other countries have their own name for as well. These were the 4 decades that broadly aligned with the emergence of the modern middle-class consumer economy in much of the developed world, along with most modern technology, art, and entertainment. And now, merging these two concepts together, today I want to talk about the cultural importance of America's 7 Showa presidents. Is this getting too esoteric? Anyway, a quite interesting fact is that for much of this era of US history, from 1961 to 1993, the US presidency was held by 7 men who were all born around the same time, the longest unbroken hold that any generation has ever held on the US presidency, in fact. And as a result, these 7 men all had a lot in common. They all went to college in the late 1930s and early 1940s. They all served in the military during the Second World War, almost all in the Navy. They all got married around the same time and had a similar number of kids. All of them likewise had politician as their primary occupation, usually in federal politics. Most of them moved pretty swiftly from college to the military to politics and got elected to some sort of office in their 30s. Then they served in government for several decades and became president when they were fairly old. I mean, these days we're used to the presidents being really old, but back then having a president in his late 50s or 60s was considered relatively unusual. 3 of these men were actually among the oldest presidents in US history at the time. And having so much in common makes these presidents quite interesting to analyze as a bundle of cultural figures. They were all generally vain and self-important men who believed themselves to uniquely understand the importance of the post-war era. In their own way, they were also all relatively conservative, or at least traditionalistic, believing strongly in the wisdom of America's democratic institutions and the importance of perpetuating stereotypically middle-class American values, especially as an alternative to communism and socialism, which were seen as the greatest ideological threat to the American way of life during the Cold War. But at the same time, these 7 men were also different in key ways. They came from different parts of the country and different social classes, different religious traditions, and different political parties. And though they were all ostentatiously patriotic, they also interpreted the challenges of the post-war era differently. And today we remember them as symbolic personifications of the different attitudes and values that fell in and out of favor during this critical 30-year period. So today, I thought I would just offer little summaries of these 7 men, why they mattered, what they came to represent, and why they are worth remembering today. I want to talk less about the political decisions they made and more about what their rise and fall has been interpreted to mean from a cultural perspective. But before we get to that, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Incogni. Hello friends. So I was just reading the newspaper and I see that there was another one of those giant internet data breaches, you know, where the credit card numbers and home addresses and phone numbers of tons of people got leaked. And who knows who's got it now? Could it be Angela Rayner? Who can say? Now, these sorts of stories are happening all of the time, but what are you doing about it? Ignoring it and hoping everything just works out? Well, my friends, I was once just like you. But then I got Incogni. You see, one of the best ways to protect yourself from data breaches is to just have less personal information about yourself online in the first place. And an important way to do that is to exercise your legal rights to ask companies to delete any of the information on you that they currently possess. But most of us don't know how to do that, so Incogni does it for you. They send out automated requests to their vast Rolodex of data brokers and keep you informed as those companies comply with your data deletion requests. Just look at all the companies that have deleted their data on me. Thanks, Incogni. If you need an incentive to give this amazing service a try, how does 60% off an annual subscription sound? Just sign up using the link in the thing below and use the promo code JJMCC. So stop ignoring a problem that we all know is happening. Take control of your digital life and give Incogni a try today. So even though World War II ended in 1945, I think you can plausibly argue that John F. Kennedy was America's first true post-war president. The president who came before him, Dwight David Eisenhower, had been the commander of the Allied forces in World War II and represented the continued control of the American government by men born in the late 1800s. JFK, by contrast, was both the first president born in the 20th century and the first to have served as a soldier in the Second World War. So Kennedy's 1960 election as president was seen as a very symbolically important transition from the end of the long 19th century to a new generation of leaders with fresh 20th century values.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed.
JFK was only 43 when he was elected, which is still a record to this day, and he appointed a lot of equally young people to senior jobs in his administration. The best and the brightest was the flattering nickname for Kennedy's cabinet. Kennedy came from an aristocratic Massachusetts family that would proceed to become the most influential political dynasty in American history. His father had been an ambassador, and his two brothers had important political careers as well, as would several of their children. In those days, people were a bit less cynical towards dynastic wealth and power, so the Kennedys were considered these very glamorous characters, and the press enjoyed playing up their rich people style and charm. JFK's 31-year-old wife, the quiet and gentle Jackie Kennedy, was held up as a particular pinnacle of feminine beauty and elegance. She was idolized as a role model by millions of American women, and to this day is still probably the most famous first lady of all time. But as we know, Kennedy did not serve long as president, and he was brutally assassinated in Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November, 1963. John F. Kennedy's glamorous life getting cut short in such a hideous way, with his handsome skull exploding all over Jackie's pink Chanel suit, was one of the most traumatizing moments in the history of the United States. Many Americans who were teens or children at the time would later say that this was the moment in which they realized that the world was not a fairy tale, but a bleak place defined by senseless pain and violence. That cruel lesson was then overlearned and mutated into elaborate conspiracy theories about who was really behind Kennedy's death, many of which posited that the highest levels of American society were full of unimaginably cruel and wicked people who were prepared to use murder as a way of advancing their personal power. But on the other hand, JFK's abrupt death and Mrs. Kennedy's retreat into relative seclusion for the rest of her life also allowed memories of the Kennedy presidency to get frozen in time in a way that often happens when famous people die prematurely. Camelot became the popular phrase to describe the world of the Kennedy White House in reference to a popular romantic Broadway musical of the time. In reality, John Kennedy was far from being a sinless man. He was a chronic adulterer and obviously made his share of bad political decisions. But the degree that his presidency represented a symbolic moment of hope and promise has mostly overshadowed everything else about him. And to this day, we still talk of charming and charismatic young politicians as being Kennedy-esque. After Kennedy's death, his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, took over. A Democrat from Texas, Johnson had first been elected to Congress back in 1937 and was considered an extremely canny and sophisticated politician, if also a bit underhanded and ruthless. Even now, LBJ's skill as a negotiator and deal maker and arm twister is held up as a model for other politicians to emulate. In private, Johnson had a charming and often vulgar personality, but in public, he tried to project an image of being very uptight and proper, a competent middle-aged man who wasn't as cool as Kennedy, but knew how to do what had to be done to advance their shared agenda for post-war America.
Although the struggle for progressive change is continuous, there are times when a watershed is reached, when there is, if not really a break with the past, at least the fulfillment of many of its oldest hopes, and a stepping forth into a new environment to seek new goals.
The Johnson administration is usually seen as the high point of the post-war American liberal consensus, and a period in which all sorts of American laws were reformed in a more progressive direction, including ending the second-class citizenship of African Americans and expanding social assistance to the poor and needy. I say the American liberal consensus because Johnson himself was not considered a particularly radical or ideological politician. He was just the man competent enough to spearhead the reform agenda that majorities in both parties believed in at the time. I remember I had an American history professor in college who once grandly declared that Johnson would probably be remembered as the single greatest president in US history if he hadn't also made the decision to deepen America's involvement in the Vietnamese Civil War. During his presidency, over 1 million young Americans would be drafted to fight in what would prove to be a pointless, unwinnable foreign conflict. Over 35,000 American soldiers were killed, alongside an even greater number of Vietnamese civilians. Johnson ended his presidency as a heavily demonized figure among draft-age Americans, particularly on college campuses. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? They would chant. The massive bloodshed of the war having overshadowed his progressive accomplishments, Johnson left office in 1969 in a fashion not unlike Kennedy, with growing public cynicism about the sort of people running the United States. So I did a whole video about Richard Nixon recently, so I'll try not to be too redundant here. Basically, Nixon was a very uptight, conservative man, elected to be an antidote to the growing cultural division that was consuming America in the late 1960s. All right, so it is important to understand the generational divide that existed in the America of Nixon's time. Like all the presidents we are looking at today, Nixon was part of a generation of World War II veterans who had returned to America eager to settle down and establish a stable, conservative bourgeois society. The boomers, meanwhile, were the children of Nixon's generation, and they increasingly found post-war bourgeois society to be oppressive, phony, and dishonest in the wake of things like Kennedy's murder and the Vietnam War. These kids went to college in greater numbers than ever before and proved to be more open-minded and experimental when it came to things like sex and drugs, and often embraced political opinions that were far to the left of the American mainstream. Nixon and the men around him hated and feared this rising boomer counterculture. They blamed it for violence in America's cities, racial unrest, growing rates of divorce and abortion, and all sorts of other things. And for standing against all of this, Nixon was very popular with voters of his generation for a while. He enjoyed great cultural cachet as the sane, stable guardian of traditional American values, in contrast to the wild hippies and feminists and anarchists and all the rest.
As President of the United States, I would be untrue to my oath of office if I allowed the policy of this nation to be dictated by the minority who hold that point of view and who try to impose it on the nation by mounting demonstrations in the street.
But Nixon's presidency eventually became consumed by the Watergate scandal, in which it was revealed that despite his carefully crafted image as an honest, decent man, Nixon had actually been using the power of the government in deeply unethical and even illegal ways to target his political and cultural enemies. Revealed tape recordings of his Oval Office conversations would similarly expose that in private he was constantly swearing and saying terrible, bigoted things about Jews and blacks and gays and others. Nixon resigned in 1974, the first president to ever do so, and in the aftermath became the leading symbol of corruption, hypocrisy, and disgrace in American politics. And because everybody loves a good villain, he has also probably had the largest role in American pop culture of any modern president. Once again, always serving as the quintessential symbol of the ugly side of US politics. Only quite recently has Nixon's cultural reputation started to improve, and in part that's just because our own era has gotten so cynical to the point where we assume that even the worst politician from the 1970s can't possibly be as bad as anything we have today. Gerald Ford served very briefly as president after Nixon resigned, the second shortest serving president of the 20th century. He is notable among presidential trivia buffs because he was the only man who was never elected to serve as president, even indirectly, because he was never elected to be vice president either. He had been appointed Nixon's successor by Congress in 1973 in a nearly unanimous bipartisan vote that signaled his status as a well-respected member of the American political establishment, having served in Washington since 1949. The most notable thing that Ford did as president was immediately give Richard Nixon a full pardon for any crimes he may have committed in office.
As we are a nation under God, so I am sworn to uphold our laws with the help of God. And I have sought such guidance and searched my own conscience with special diligence to determine the right thing for me to do with respect to my predecessor in this place, Richard Nixon, and his loyal wife and family.
And this promptly tanked Ford's reputation before it could even get off the ground. The pardon was seen as a great betrayal by a lot of Americans, depressing evidence that the Washington political elite ultimately looked after its own, with men like Nixon facing a different standard of judgment than everybody else. Ford's reputation as the ultimate establishment man played into a lot of popular cultural stereotypes of him as well, where he was often cast as this thick-headed idiot who just did what was expected of him without any independent thought. I like this political cartoon by Ralph Steadman showing the American political system producing a whole assembly line of Gerald Fords. Though Ford's decision to pardon Nixon remains controversial to this day, later in his life there was more grudging respect for it, and it was understood as a bit of a well-meaning effort to at least put the pain of Watergate definitively in the past. Jimmy Carter beat Ford in the 1976 presidential election in what was seen as perhaps the most dramatic shakeup of American politics since Kennedy. Carter was the first president in nearly 6 decades to have no connection to Washington, D.C. at all. He was the governor of Georgia, a state in the Deep South that wasn't considered very politically important. But this was also a big part of Carter's appeal. He had been elected precisely because he was so successful at marketing himself as the ultimate outsider, a fundamentally honest, even simple man who was guided by his strong Christian faith and unwavering sense of right and wrong. While all those other presidents had been wasting their youth being corrupt Washington hacks, Jimmy Carter had spent his 30s working as a humble peanut farmer. In reality, his peanut farm wasn't all that humble, and Carter was a pretty wealthy man, but the myth of the modest peanut farmer named Jimmy from Georgia formed a powerful part of the Carter allure. So these days, we tend to think of politics in a very ideological way, and people sometimes try to retroactively describe Carter as being a very left-wing president, but in his own time, that's not really how he was conceptualized. As my buddy Andre does a good job describing in this recent video he made on him, Carter's presidency was actually a somewhat odd interregnum in post-war American history, a 4-year period presided over by a very unusual president with a high degree of righteous confidence that he could solve all of the country's problems in a very calm and pragmatic, fact-based way. In practice, however, his government quickly earned a reputation for indecisiveness and weakness, since Carter seemed to have an aversion to making tough decisions and often got extremely high-minded and pious about everything. On that front, the most culturally iconic moment of his presidency was his so-called malaise speech of July 15th, 1979, in which he scolded his fellow politicians, himself, and basically all of American society for being intellectually and spiritually ill-equipped to deal with the staggeringly complex challenges facing the modern United States.
2/3 of our people do not even vote. The productivity of American workers is actually dropping. And the willingness of Americans to save for the future has fallen below that of all other people in the Western world. As you know, there is a growing disrespect for government and for churches.
Carter was thrown out of office in a big landslide in 1980, the first president to lose re-election in almost 50 years. He obviously left the White House quite unpopular, but many Americans still admired him for his ethics and honesty. Having spent most of his post-presidency doing charity work, he is now pretty widely regarded as having been one of the best human beings to have ever been president, even if that didn't correlate with his goodness as president. In 1981, 69-year-old Ronald Reagan became the oldest president in American history, which reflected the fact that the World War II generation was getting increasingly elderly. Reagan is interesting as a cultural figure because he basically embodies the whole evolution of thought that many Americans of his generation had gone through over the last 3 decades. Like Carter, Reagan had never served in Washington, D.C. He was a Hollywood actor of modest fame who had been elected governor of California in the late 1960s. And though his rise to power was unusual for its time, it is pretty similar to the sort of thing we see a lot these days, where some random politician becomes a beloved folk hero to a big chunk of the country because he is so good at articulating a philosophical message that a lot of Americans really want to hear.
We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help?
My favorite ever piece of writing on Reagan And one of my favorite pieces of political writing, period, is this essay by Hendrik Hertzberg called The Child Monarch. In it, he describes Reagan as a sentimental liberal who became a sentimental conservative, which is to say, somebody who had supported the Democrats when they had been the party of patriotism and strong leadership during World War II, but then after the war, identified more with Republicans like Nixon, who were imagined to be fighting an equally important battle against the new enemies of America at home. Like Nixon, Reagan's speeches were defined by themes of him just being an old-fashioned man who wanted to see America return to the sort of values that he had grown up with. He was in fact the first guy to use the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And by the 1980s, the majority of Americans had come around to this way of thinking. There was a certain exhaustion with the politics of the liberal consensus that had reached its peak under Johnson and continued to varying degrees under the presidents who followed. Not to mention a desire to move out of the shadow of Vietnam and Watergate and the fecklessness of Jimmy Carter. So in many ways, Reagan was just the right man in the right place at the right time and proved an effective figurehead capable of rallying together a broad coalition of conservative factions that existed in America in the early 1980s, including businessmen, suburbanites, evangelical Christians, veterans, seniors, and even a huge chunk of ambitious young people as well. He was a grandfatherly, upbeat man with a fundamentally comforting, reassuring personality, combined with an actor's knack for making charismatic speeches and an old person's silly sense of humor.
As long as there are final exams, there will be prayer in schools.
And because the 80s proved to be a generally prosperous and peaceful time for the United States, in contrast to the 60s and 70s, Reagan was the first president since Kennedy who seemed to be genuinely well cast for his era. Reagan was the longest serving president of the group we're discussing, with a full 8 years in office. Near the end of his second term, however, his shine began to wear off a bit, with aspects of his personality that had once seemed endearing now starting to take on a more unsettling tone. Reagan's small band of critics had long insisted that the president just wasn't very bright and was mostly just being puppeteered by a gaggle of behind-the-scenes people who were determined to push a much harder right political agenda than most Americans wanted. And the degree that this was true became harder to deny as fights between Reagan's various advisors started to spill into the news in the late 80s. There were a lot of stories about the degree that Reagan was just much less involved in day-to-day government than the other presidents, and the degree that this resulted in a lot of important political decisions being outsourced to people like his chief of staff, his national security advisor, his wife, even his astrologer. We also now know that Reagan was starting to experience early-stage Alzheimer's disease near the end of his tenure, which would permanently take him out of the public spotlight shortly after he left office in 1989. A big part of the defining scandal of the Reagan years, the Iran-Contra affair, basically revolved around the degree that Reagan was clueless of a lot of what was going on in his own administration, while his right-wing counselors just did whatever they wanted on their own. This is where the child monarch idea comes from. The idea that Reagan's greatest strength was as a symbolic, sentimental figure rather than an active administrator of the government. In the end, the lesson that Republicans chose to learn from the popularity of the Reagan presidency was that Americans really like orthodox, conservative political philosophy. This then made the post-Reagan Republican Party much more ideologically coherent and helped push the Democrats to define themselves as America's consistently progressive party in response. To the extent that his conservatism helped shape the character of the American two-party system that exists today, it is common to consider Reagan one of the top 3 most important presidents of the 20th century, even if you don't think the accomplishments of his government were all that great. And lastly, we have George H.W. Bush, or as he was known in his own time, just plain old George Bush. Bush had been Reagan's vice president, and his 1988 election was seen as an extension of Reagan's still high popularity. To this day, the Bush-Reagan era remains the single longest period of one-party rule in America since the end of the Second World War. Bush was the last veteran of that war to serve as president, and he was in office when the Soviet Union collapsed, making him the final president of the Cold War, as well as the last member of a particular class of post-war professional Washington politicians to hold the job, although you could argue that Biden actually fits into this category as well. Today, the dominant cultural image of George H.W. Bush is as the patriarch of a somewhat lamer version of the Kennedy political dynasty. But in his own time, he was mostly known for being a Ford-esque man of the Washington elite. He had been in Congress during the 60s and held various jobs in the Nixon and Ford cabinets before joining the Reagan administration in 1981. And fundamentally, he just wasn't that exciting. Almost certainly the most boring of all of the presidents we've discussed today. He was a stiff and formal 65-year-old bureaucrat with a nasally voice and awkward way of speaking.
For not only leadership is passed from generation to generation, but so is stewardship. And the generation born after the Second World War has come of age. I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good.
Because he was fundamentally a creature of Washington from a wealthy family, as the years went on, he became increasingly caricatured as a man who was both out of date and out of touch, and his supposed empathy gap with ordinary Americans is usually described as having played a decisive role in the fact that he was unseated in 1992 by 45-year-old Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas, who would become the country's first boomer president. I feel like George H.W. Bush is becoming quite fashionable to like these days, in part because many of the qualities that had made him seem dated and oblivious in his own time, like his patrician manners and his long resume, are now easy to sentimentalize as the impressive characteristics of a more serious and dignified crop of politicians than the ones we have now. George Bush's eldest son would of course become America's second boomer president from 2001 to 2009, but I've always found it interesting how little sentimentality for the old man Bush played in George W.'s political rise. Despite being father and son, they had quite different personalities and political dispositions, to the point where I don't even really think there's that much overlap between fans of one and fans of the other. So there you go, America's Showa 7. The men whose generational journey of self-discovery played such a large role in helping shape the country's collective cultural memories of the 3 decades they presided over. Putting aside any specific public policies that they did or didn't do, what do you think of these guys as cultural figures? As a group, what do you think they reveal about post-war America in contrast to today? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.